Well, we are coming towards the end of an incredible 2 days here at RetailSpaces, and I think it's appropriate that the topic of permitting is the last thing keeping a room full of retailers from getting any work done. My name is Andreas Rotenberg, and I'm one of the founders of Pulley. Our mission is to help project teams break ground faster. And today, we're proud to help some of the fastest growing retailers submit, track, and manage permits nationwide. But I actually started my career in retail development, and it was probably the most stressful experience of my working life, in no small part because of permitting. I actually went to therapy for about a year after quitting my last job in retail, and I suspect I'm not the first. Which brings me to the subject of today's talk. If I learned anything in therapy, it's that sometimes to get past a problem, you've got to go back to the beginning and retrace your steps. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to explore what went wrong with permitting and how we fix it. Now, a lot of things have gotten better in the last 60 years, but construction is famously not one of them. Whereas labor productivity in the United States has improved by 300% in the last 60 years, construction productivity has actually declined by about 6%. But that's a rounding error compared to permitting, which has gotten 400% slower in the same time span. I'll just let that sink in for a moment. Consider a simple ground-up project in the Boston suburbs where I grew up. Might take 4 months to build, but 16 months to entitle and permit. Relative to 1960, that drop in construction productivity cost you 1 week in your schedule. The slowdown in permitting and entitlements has cost you a year. How did we end up in a world where it takes 4 times longer to permit a building than to build it? Well, the story begins almost 4,000 years ago in ancient Babylon. We're going back to the beginning. The first building code was contained within a legal framework called Hammurabi's Code. You learned about this in high school. You forgot about it, but I'll remind you, it's where we got the phrase, an eye for an eye. Now, there were no permits and there were no inspections in ancient Babylon. You didn't have to wait for any approval to start building. But basically what this quote is saying is that if you're a builder and you don't follow the rules, you're financially responsible if the building proves to be unsound. And this approach actually lives on in places like New York City today, where architects can self-certify a project. You don't have to go through a whole plan review process with the city. The architect just promises that the work is code compliant, and if a city inspector disagrees at some point, you got to fix it. During the Renaissance, building was regulated in a different way. Trade groups called guilds were not only responsible for training master builders, they were also responsible for inspecting their work. And builders held each other to a very high standard. Many of our most loved buildings today were built this way and are still standing 800 years later. If you think about it, it's a lot like hiring a private provider in Florida to do a plan check or an inspection. Rather than relying on a city employee to tell you what you can or can't do, you hire one engineer to review another engineer's work. But permitting as we know it today in most places, where a government agency authorizes private construction, only emerged in the late 19th century. Following the Industrial Revolution, American cities were getting big and crowded, and we were starting to see new utilities like gas and electricity make their way onto the streets of those cities. But at the same time, the buildings were old. If you walk down the street in any American city, what you would see is a lot of buildings made of timber with tar shingle roofs. And that turned out to be a very dangerous combination. In 1871, there were 25 major fires in American cities. During the Great Fire of Chicago, roughly a third of the city burned to the ground. And in Boston, that same year, there was such a huge fire that it ignited the city's new gas lines. And it got so bad that the mayor of Boston started to deputize private citizens to go around with gunpowder to blow up buildings just to try to slow down the spread of the fire. Now, business owners were not pleased. We literally asked for permitting. So cities like New York and Boston set up buildings departments within the fire department to ensure that cities were planned and structures were built to withstand the threat of fire. The impact on project timelines was negligible. Probably took just a few days to get all the approvals you needed to build back in 1900. So far, permitting seems like a pretty good solution to a clearly defined problem. Well, in the decades that followed, that pattern repeated itself. When a new problem emerged, local officials would try to address it in the way that they could think to, which was by adding. It turns out that human beings are hardwired to solve problems through addition rather than subtraction. We're more likely to be impressed by the colleague who suggests tracking some new metric than the one who suggests killing a useless meeting. It's not even that we value addition more. Oftentimes, we don't even realize it's possible to solve a problem through subtraction. Two psychologists showed that people will reach for another Lego block to make a pattern, or even two Lego blocks, rather than just subtracting one that doesn't belong. It's a shout out to the Lego team who I know are here. The connection to permitting is obvious. We have continuously added new requirements without ever subtracting anything. First, cities introduced zoning everywhere except Houston, which is obvious if you've been to Houston. Then came environmental protections like CEQA in California. It's one of my favorite four-letter words. All great in theory, but as the requirements piled up, the size of permit applications ballooned from 10 pages to 50. And as America grew, we created a lot more cities and towns, each with their own unique way of approving permits. The people doing the building also changed. Shopkeepers building in their hometown were replaced by all of you, national retailers building all over the place. So by the eve of the financial crisis in 2009, that same retail project in Boston that took just a few months took a full year to be able to break ground. And I wish the story ended there, but there is unfortunately one more slide here. In the wake of the Great Recession, we started to see the impact of a labor shortage. There were very few experienced plan reviewers in cities. And after the pandemic, it was very hard to get a hold of them, to find them in person or even get them on the phone. And the result is that today, you can easily wait 4 to 8 weeks just to get a comment letter. And that's why it takes 16 months to break ground. More permits, more sheets in a plan set, and more jurisdictions taking longer to review them. So how do we make permitting faster today? Well, the obvious answer is to focus on what cities could do differently. They could outsource plan review or allow for self-certification. It's really not hard to come up with the ideas for permitting reform because, as we've seen, most of these ideas have been around for thousands of years. The hard part is figuring out how to convince 19,000 different jurisdictions. It literally took a global pandemic to convince these people to accept a PDF rather than a printed plan set. So today, I want to look at the problem from a different angle. I want to explore the changes to process and the new technologies that project teams can adopt to deal with the challenge and the complexity posed by permitting in 2025 and beyond. And I want to specifically focus on 3 areas. First, how do we make local permitting requirements more accessible? Second, how do we speed up the process of making submittals? And third, how do we make it faster to check drawings for compliance? Fixing permitting for teams starts with getting the requirements right. Whether you're a national retailer or a regional developer, the odds are that when you do a new project, it's probably in a place that you haven't built in for at least 5 years, which means that your team has to wrap their heads around a totally new approval process. Well, a platform like Pulley enables you to see exactly which permits, approvals, and submittal items are required for that project, as well as to forecast the time it will take you to get an approval. But what if we could generate a preliminary due diligence report for you on a site just based on the data that already lives in tools you're using like Procore and Autodesk? Well, with the right integrations and improvements in computer vision, we're actually a lot closer than you might think. Next, I want to talk about how we speed up the submittal preparation process. We use software tools to manage every aspect of a construction project except for permitting. So it's really not surprising that this is an area where balls get dropped, and not just by cities. At Pulley, we've built tools that break permitting down into a discrete set of tasks. Each task has a due date and an assignee. And just like everything in life, clear deadlines and accountability drive better outcomes. And there are other incredible companies building solutions to help you hit those deadlines. I don't know how many folks in this room have ever seen TestFit. You probably saw it on LinkedIn. Well, what they've done is they've designed tools that let you build a site plan in just a few minutes in a very intuitive way. And in the years to come, they will be massive beneficiaries of advances in generative AI. So your architects and engineers will be able to create construction documents way faster. All in all, I suspect that by 2030, we'll be cutting down the time it takes to make a submittal by about 2 weeks, which over the course of a ground-up project adds up to 2 months back in your schedule. Finally, how can we streamline the process of check-in plans for code compliance? At Pulley, we say everyone has to go through plan review once. No one has to go through plan review 5 times. But a lot of people do. Now, there are no silver bullets here, right? The best way to reduce time spent waiting for city reviewers is to submit a great set of plans. It starts with hiring great consultants. Nothing is possible without that. But that's not enough. You've also got to make sure that they're working together. And cloud-based design collaboration tools like Bluebeam can help a group of consultants put together a plan set that is internally consistent. And these tools would be even more powerful if city staff were using them too. Think about how tight that feedback loop would be between making a set of changes to a plan set and getting back around to comments. But I wouldn't hold your breath just yet. Same goes for code analysis tools. Upcodes has made it easy to search and interpret the building code. But what if software, not independently, but in coordination with architects and plan reviewers, could help flag potential code issues? We could reduce the time it takes to scrub one of those 50-page permit applications from a few days to a few minutes. This really could be the first decade in 150 years where permitting gets faster, especially for retailers that are willing to take matters into their own hands, invest in great people, and adopt the right tools. As I said before, when it comes to permitting, there are no silver bullets, and it never gets easier, but it can go faster. Thanks for listening.